For the last 24 hours, I've been tracking a sequence of events that reveals far more about how U.S. foreign policy actually operates than what you'll hear on most news broadcasts. What happened between Sunday night and Monday morning wasn't just another update in a Middle East conflict. It was a moment where markets, diplomacy, and information warfare all collided in real time. Let's start with the timeline. On Saturday, Donald Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum through Truth Social. The message was simple. If Iran didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the United States would target Iranian energy infrastructure, including power plants. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded immediately, warning that any attack would trigger retaliation against energy and desalination facilities across the Gulf. Oil markets reacted instantly. Prices surged to roughly $114 a barrel. The countdown had begun, and analysts around the world were watching Monday evening, the moment the deadline would expire. Then Monday morning arrived. Trump posted again. This time the tone was completely different. He said the United States and Iran had engaged in very productive conversations over the previous 2 days and were moving toward a full resolution of hostilities. According to the Post, Jared Kushner and envoy Steve Witkoff had met with an Iranian official the night before. Trump announced that planned strikes on Iranian infrastructure would be delayed for 5 days to allow negotiations to continue. Markets reacted within minutes. Oil dropped nearly 14%. Stock futures jumped. Wall Street interpreted the announcement as a sign the crisis might be ending. But less than an hour later, the situation shifted again. Iran's foreign ministry released its own statement saying no negotiations were happening, no meetings, no talks, no agreement. They described Trump's claim as psychological warfare aimed at manipulating oil markets and distracting from what they called a strategic failure by the United States and Israel. So within the span of one morning, two completely different realities were presented. In Washington's version, negotiations were underway and strikes were paused. In Tehran's version, there were no negotiations at all. Meanwhile, the region itself continued escalating. Air raid sirens sounded in Bahrain. Lebanese officials reported casualties from overnight attacks. And the original 48-hour ultimatum quietly expired. For someone who studies information warfare and political messaging, what happened next was revealing. Markets didn't rally because peace had been achieved. They rallied because investors believed something else, that the president who threatened escalation might actually want to avoid it. Bloomberg captured the dynamic perfectly. They noted that the market reaction happened even before Iran denied the talks, because traders interpreted Trump's message as evidence that the administration was looking for a way out of a war that had already begun destabilizing the global economy. That distinction matters. The rally wasn't confidence in a diplomatic breakthrough. It was a market calculation that the White House might not follow through on its own ultimatum. To understand why that matters, you have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. 3 weeks ago, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury with the promise of a quick and decisive campaign. Today, the situation looks very different. The Strait of Hormuz remains partially closed. Iran has been selectively allowing ships from neutral or friendly countries to pass while blocking U.S.-aligned vessels. The original strike deadline has already passed without action. Oil prices, even after Monday's drop, remain dramatically higher than they were before the conflict began. And the economic consequences are spreading. Energy costs have surged. Inflation pressure is rising again. And the Federal Reserve now faces a difficult choice: cutting interest rates while energy-driven inflation remains elevated, or holding rates high and slowing the economy. But the Middle East conflict isn't the only pressure point. At the same time this crisis has been unfolding, another major diplomatic event has been pushed into uncertainty: the planned U.S.-China summit in Beijing. Before the war began, that meeting was supposed to be one of the defining diplomatic moments of the year. Trump's strategy toward China relied heavily on tariffs as leverage in negotiations. But in February, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the legal framework supporting several of those tariffs. That ruling removed one of Washington's main negotiating tools just weeks before the summit. Now add the war in Iran, The summit has already been delayed, with Trump stating that managing the conflict requires him to remain in Washington, and that delay changes the dynamics. China enters the meeting from a position of relative stability, with record trade surpluses and expanding influence across global supply chains. The United States enters while managing a regional conflict, dealing with rising energy prices, and preparing for negotiations without the tariff leverage it previously relied on. That imbalance could shape what happens when the two leaders eventually sit down. The summit was expected to focus on economic deliverables: Chinese purchases of American soybeans, aircraft orders from Boeing, and long term contracts for U.S. liquefied natural gas. Those agreements matter because they provide visible economic benefits that political leaders can point to at home. But deals like that rarely happen without concessions. And in this case, the concession China wants most is clear: easing restrictions on advanced technology exports, particularly semiconductors and AI chips. For Beijing, access to advanced technology is central to its long term economic strategy, which means the negotiations may ultimately revolve around a familiar trade off: market access in exchange for technological flexibility. When you look at the broader situation, multiple pressures are converging at the same time. Energy markets remain volatile. The trade relationship with China is entering a critical phase, and domestic economic policy in the United States is being constrained by rising inflation. For ordinary households, those pressures show up in everyday ways: higher fuel prices, higher grocery bills, mortgage rates that remain elevated because central banks can't cut interest rates while inflation is rising. And all of it traces back to decisions being made in geopolitical conflicts far from home. So, what happens next? Trump's 5-day pause on military strikes ends this Saturday. If negotiations truly exist behind the scenes, those talks may produce some kind of temporary framework, perhaps a partial reopening of the Strait of Hormuz combined with broader diplomatic discussions. But if Iran's statement is accurate and no negotiations are taking place, then the same decision returns in a few days: escalate the conflict and risk another surge in oil prices, or step back again and face questions about credibility. Either outcome carries consequences. Even if a ceasefire eventually emerges, the economic and strategic effects of the past 3 weeks won't disappear overnight. Energy markets have already been disrupted, diplomatic timelines have already shifted, and alliances strained by sudden military action won't instantly reset. That's the reality behind the headlines. So here's the real question. When Saturday arrives and the pause expires, will there be an actual agreement on the table? Or will the world find itself right back where it was, watching oil prices spike while governments argue over whether negotiations ever existed in the first place? Let me know what you think, because the answer to that question could determine where energy prices and the global economy go next. And if you want deeper breakdowns of the forces driving these headlines, consider subscribing, because the real story isn't the press release, it's the sequence behind it.